Imagine standing on the shores of the Bosporus in the early 14th century, looking out at a small collection of tents and mud brick houses, surrounded by forests and hills, barely noticeable on the edge of a crumbling Byzantine world. Few could have predicted that this tiny, obscure group of Turkish tribes would rise to rule 3 continents, shape the fate of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and endure for more than 6 centuries. Yet by the time the Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922, the memory of its glory had faded in the West, and even in much of the world it once dominated, leaving behind fragments of stories, half-truths and legends that rarely captured the complexity of its rise and influence. The Ottoman Empire was not born in palaces or from the ambitions of kings. It began with a small tribe led by Osman of Feth, a chieftain who in 1299 declared independence from the Seljuk Turks and began a campaign to carve a state in northwestern Anatolia. At that time, the region was chaotic. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty, was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal strife and external attacks. Neighboring Turkish principalities were constantly fighting each other, and yet Osman's clan managed to consolidate power not through sheer size, but through a combination of clever alliances, strategic marriages, and a reputation for bravery that drew warriors to his banner. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had begun their slow expansion into Europe, crossing the Dardanelles and establishing footholds in Thrace. Each conquest was calculated. Unlike the purely destructive campaigns of some medieval powers, the Ottomans often allowed conquered peoples to retain their religion, their local governance, and their traditions in exchange for loyalty and taxes. This pragmatic approach won them allies and prevented revolts that might have destroyed smaller empires. It also allowed them to govern a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population, a challenge that would later define the empire at its height. As they expanded, the Ottomans developed a sophisticated system of administration. Early sultans understood that conquest alone was not enough. Maintaining power required order, infrastructure, and systems of governance that could endure beyond a single ruler's lifetime. They built a bureaucracy that could manage diverse regions from Anatolia to the Balkans, trained administrators to enforce law and collect taxes, and relied on a standing army that was loyal not to individual lords, but to the Sultan himself. By the time of Orhan, Osman's son, in the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had transformed from a tribal confederation into a state capable of challenging older empires. The conquest of Bursa in 1326 marked the first significant Ottoman city and became the first imperial capital, signaling a shift from a frontier clan to a permanent dynasty. This victory also demonstrated the empire's strategic intelligence. Bursa was not just a city, it was a hub of trade and wealth, connecting Anatolia to the Mediterranean and the interior of Asia Minor. Controlling it meant controlling commerce, which in turn funded further military campaigns. The Ottomans' ability to integrate diverse cultures and religions into their administration became one of their greatest strengths. They embraced a system later known as the millet system, which allowed different religious communities, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, to govern themselves in matters of personal law while remaining loyal to the Sultan. This flexibility prevented widespread rebellion, fostered economic growth, and created a model for governing a vast empire without excessive coercion. By the late 14th century, the Ottomans were no longer a regional power. They were a looming force that European leaders could not ignore. Their victories at Nicopolis in 1396 and Varna in 1444, though costly, showed Europe that the Ottomans could field armies capable of challenging knights, mercenaries, and entire kingdoms. And yet, despite their military prowess, the Ottomans were not purely warlike. They invested in architecture, science and trade, building mosques, bridges and caravans that facilitated both commerce and culture. Cities like Edirne and later Istanbul would become symbols of this dual identity, simultaneously martial and refined. Perhaps the most striking feature of the early Ottoman period was their resilience. Empires often collapse because they overextend or fail to adapt. The Ottomans, even as they expanded into foreign territories with different languages, religions and customs, created mechanisms to absorb these differences into a functioning system. This adaptability allowed them to survive internal revolts, external invasions and periods of weak leadership, ensuring the dynasty would last for centuries. By the time the 15th century approached, the Ottoman Empire was ready to achieve what many thought impossible, the conquest of Constantinople. But even before this defining moment, the world was beginning to take notice. Venice, Genoa, and other maritime powers saw the Ottomans as both a threat and an opportunity, negotiating trade agreements while secretly fearing the day the Crescent Banner would reach the gates of Europe's richest cities. The story of the Ottoman Empire's rise is a story of vision, strategy, and patience. It is the story of a people who transformed from a small frontier tribe into rulers of an empire that would shape history for over 6 centuries. And yet, by the early 20th century, much of that history had been reduced to myths, stereotypes, and simplified narratives of decline. The empire's cultural, scientific, and political achievements were overshadowed by its final collapse and the rise of modern nation-states. Understanding the Ottoman Empire is not just an exercise in nostalgia. It is a way to understand the forces that shaped the modern world, the movement of peoples, the clashes of civilizations, the rise of trade networks, and the endurance of cultural traditions. Their story is both a cautionary tale and a testament to human ingenuity, showing how a small group of determined people can leave a mark on the world that endures long after their empire has vanished. The empire may have officially ended with the abolition of the Sultanate in 1922 and the declaration of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, but its legacy lives on in architecture, cuisine, language, law, and the memories of the millions who once lived under its rule. The Ottoman Empire was a giant whose shadow still touches the world today, even if many no longer remember its full scale or brilliance. To understand the Ottomans is to understand the hidden threads of history that connect continents, cultures, and centuries. In the early 13th century, Anatolia was a land of chaos. The once mighty Seljuk Sultanate was crumbling under pressure from Mongol invasions and internal rebellions. Villages were abandoned, trade routes disrupted, and the countryside teetered between lawlessness and constant raiding. It was in this turbulent environment that the ancestors of the Ottomans struggled to survive. They were not kings or conquerors, merely a small tribal confederation, eking out an existence on the margins of history, their lives measured in seasons, survival, and the constant threat of rivals. Every day was a battle, not for glory, but for the simple right to exist. Around 1299, Osman I emerged as a charismatic leader with a vision that went beyond mere survival. He was known for his courage in battle and his ability to unite disparate clans under a single banner. Legend tells of him rallying his followers with speeches that promised both honor and security, blending tribal loyalty with a broader vision of statehood. In a world where the strong preyed on the weak, Osman's ability to inspire loyalty was a critical advantage. He understood that leadership was more than force. It required strategy, diplomacy, and the promise of shared prosperity. The Ottomans' early years were defined by fluid alliances and constant skirmishes. Their neighbors included other Turkish principalities, Byzantine remnants, and rival nomadic bands. Each conquest was as much about survival as it was about expansion. Unlike many conquerors, Osman and his successors frequently incorporated defeated foes into their armies, offering positions and privileges in exchange for loyalty. This practice, unusual for the era, allowed the Ottomans to grow stronger with each victory, rather than being weakened by resentment and rebellion. By 1326, the capture of Bursa marked a turning point. This victory was more than symbolic. It provided the Ottomans with a permanent capital, economic resources, and a foothold in Asia Minor. Bursa became the center of administration, trade, and military planning. With this stronghold, the Ottomans transitioned from a wandering warrior clan into an organized state capable of sustained expansion. The city also became a magnet for scholars, artisans, and merchants, reflecting the empire's emerging identity as a center of both war and culture. Orhan, Osman's son, continued his father's vision with remarkable skill. He formalized administrative structures, creating a bureaucracy capable of governing newly conquered territories. Taxes were standardized, local leaders were integrated into the system, and courts were established to enforce law and order. The Ottomans realized early on that conquest alone was not enough. Sustainable governance was essential. By institutionalizing authority, they ensured that victories on the battlefield translated into long-term stability. Their military strategy was equally innovative. The Ottomans recognized the importance of specialized forces, recruiting skilled archers, cavalry, and infantry from both their own ranks and conquered populations. They developed the foundations of what would later become the Janissary Corps, a professional standing army loyal to the Sultan rather than local feudal lords. This system gave the Ottomans a decisive advantage over neighbors who relied on traditional feudal levies, which were often slow, poorly trained, and unreliable in battle. The 14th century also saw the Ottomans crossing into Europe for the first time. The capture of Gallipoli in 1354 gave them a strategic foothold in Thrace, opening the door for future campaigns into the Balkans. This move was not reckless, it was carefully calculated, combining military strength with alliances and political maneuvering. European powers were initially uncertain how to respond, often underestimating the Ottomans' capabilities. By the time the Battle of Kosovo loomed in 1389, the Ottomans had established themselves as a formidable force in both Anatolia and southeastern Europe. The Battle of Kosovo itself illustrates the Ottomans' growing power and strategic acumen. Facing a coalition of Serbian forces, Sultan Murad III demonstrated both tactical brilliance and political foresight. While the battle was bloody and hard-fought, it solidified Ottoman influence in the Balkans and sent a clear message: this small tribe from Anatolia was no longer merely surviving, they were conquering. Yet even as they expanded, the Ottomans maintained a reputation for pragmatic governance, incorporating local populations into their administration and respecting religious practices to ensure loyalty. Trade played a pivotal role in the tribe's transformation into a state. By controlling key routes between Asia and Europe, the Ottomans tapped into wealth that allowed them to fund armies, fortify cities, and patronize the arts. Markets flourished in cities like Bursa and Edirne, attracting merchants from Venice, Genoa, and beyond. This economic strength reinforced political power, creating a feedback loop that enabled further expansion. Wealth was not hoarded. It was invested in infrastructure, schools, mosques and bridges, signaling to subjects and rivals alike that the Ottomans were building something enduring. Religion also served as a unifying force. Islam was a core element of identity, but the Ottomans were careful to allow conquered Christian and Jewish populations to maintain their traditions. This religious tolerance, unusual for the time, minimized resistance and created a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire long before the term pluralism existed. The combination of military skill, administrative innovation, economic control, and pragmatic tolerance allowed a small warrior tribe to transform into a state capable of challenging older empires. By the turn of the 15th century, the Ottomans were no longer a marginal group. They were recognized by Europe and Asia as a rising power. Their influence extended beyond Anatolia into the Balkans, the Aegean, and the Black Sea region. The foundations laid by Osman and Orhan, grounded in strategy, organization, and vision, ensured that the empire could endure leadership changes, military setbacks, and the inherent unpredictability of conquest. What began as a struggle for survival had evolved into the creation of a state capable of shaping world history. The early Ottomans combined the ferocity of warriors with the pragmatism of administrators, the ambition of conquerors with the foresight of visionaries. Their story challenges the idea that small beginnings limit destiny. From tents and mud brick houses on the edge of Anatolia to the threshold of Europe, the Ottomans proved that strategy, unity, and adaptability can turn even the most precarious beginnings into a legacy that will echo across centuries. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had established themselves as a force few in Europe could ignore. They were no longer a small tribal confederation struggling to survive. They were a state capable of strategic campaigns, political alliances, and economic dominance. Their expansion into the Balkans was deliberate and relentless, with each conquest carefully planned to maximize resources, consolidate power, and minimize rebellion. Unlike the chaotic warfare common in the region, Ottoman campaigns were organized, disciplined, and backed by an administrative system that could integrate newly conquered peoples. The fall of Thessalonica in 1430 was one of the first major signs that the Ottomans were becoming more than just a regional power. This port city had been a vital hub for trade and military logistics in the Balkans for centuries. Its capture not only secured critical trade routes, but also demonstrated the growing sophistication of Ottoman siege warfare. European observers, who had long underestimated the Ottomans as a minor eastern threat, began to take notice. Venice, Florence, and the various Italian city-states started recalculating their political and commercial strategies, realizing that this rising power could influence trade across the Mediterranean and into the Black Sea. At the same time, the Ottomans were consolidating power in Anatolia. They absorbed smaller Turkish principalities into their administrative structure, often through negotiation, marriage alliances, and political diplomacy rather than outright conquest. This method of expansion helped create a stable base from which the empire could project military and political power further afield. Cities like Bursa, Edirne, and later Istanbul were transformed into administrative, cultural, and economic centers, reflecting a dual commitment to both martial prowess and sophisticated governance. Sultan Murad II, who ruled from 1421 to 1444 and again from 1446 to 1451, faced the enormous challenge of defending the empire's territories while continuing to expand. He implemented reforms that strengthened the army, including the development of early standing forces that would later evolve into the famed Janissaries. These troops were trained rigorously, loyal directly to the Sultan, and disciplined in a way that gave the Ottomans a decisive advantage over European feudal levies, which were often undisciplined and unreliable. Murad's strategic acumen was evident in battles such as the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, where he managed to defend Ottoman gains against a coalition of Balkan states. The Ottomans were not merely conquerors, they were state builders. Their approach to governance emphasized balance, pragmatism, and inclusion. Local leaders in newly acquired territories were often co-opted into the Ottoman administrative system. Religious communities were allowed to maintain their practices under the millet system, which ensured loyalty without forced assimilation. This careful blending of military conquest with political accommodation created stability and allowed the empire to expand more rapidly than rivals who relied solely on brute force. The economic dimension of Ottoman expansion cannot be understated. Control over the Dardanelles, the Bosporus, and key Balkan trade routes meant access to the wealth of both Europe and Asia. Cities flourished under Ottoman rule, becoming centers of commerce, craftsmanship, and culture. Wealth generated through trade funded further military campaigns and public works, reinforcing the perception that the Ottomans were not just conquerors, but effective and capable rulers. This balance of military, administrative, and economic power allowed them to sustain growth over decades, creating an empire that seemed destined for longevity. By the 1450s, the stage was set for one of the most defining events in Ottoman history, the conquest of Constantinople. For centuries, the city had been the jewel of Byzantium, a bastion of Christian power and culture, and a symbol of endurance in the face of centuries of invasions. Its strategic location, controlling trade between Europe and Asia, made it both a tempting prize and a formidable challenge. Many European powers had failed to capture it. Many others underestimated the Ottomans' ability to succeed where others had not. Mehmed II, known later as Mehmed the Conqueror, ascended to the throne in 1451 at the age of 19. Ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless. When necessary, he understood that capturing Constantinople was not just about gaining land. It was about securing legitimacy, economic dominance, and a symbolic victory that would announce the Ottomans as the supreme power in the region. Mehmed invested in modernizing the army, commissioning massive cannons, training his troops extensively, and implementing detailed siege strategies. His foresight and meticulous planning reflected the empire's broader capacity for combining vision with execution, a trait that had defined Ottoman success from Osman's earliest campaigns. In 1453, after a siege lasting nearly 2 months, Constantinople fell. The city's walls, considered impregnable for over 1,000 years, were breached by both ingenuity and persistence. Mehmed entered the city, declaring it the new capital of the Ottoman Empire, renaming it Istanbul. This conquest transformed the Ottomans from a regional power into a world-class empire. Trade routes, cultural influence, and political power all shifted decisively in their favor. European powers finally recognized that a new dominant force had emerged in the eastern Mediterranean, one capable of influencing events far beyond its borders. The capture of Constantinople was not only a military victory, but also a cultural and administrative turning point. The city became a hub for scholars, artists, and engineers from across the empire, blending Byzantine traditions with Islamic culture and Ottoman governance. Mosques, palaces, and public buildings were constructed, demonstrating the Ottomans' commitment to establishing a lasting legacy. Istanbul symbolized both the ambition and the sophistication of the empire, a testament to the vision of leaders who understood that conquest alone was not enough without cultural and administrative excellence. By combining military innovation, strategic diplomacy, economic control, and cultural integration, the Ottomans set a model for empire building that few could rival. Their expansion into Europe was not haphazard. It was calculated, sustainable, and grounded in a clear understanding of both power and politics. Each victory reinforced their authority, each city added resources and legitimacy, and each policy ensured that the empire could endure internal and external pressures. As the 15th century closed, the Ottomans were no longer seen as a frontier tribe, but as a disciplined, expansive empire. Their successes in Europe demonstrated the power of vision, planning and adaptability. Small beginnings in Anatolia had transformed into a vast empire with influence across continents. The stage was set for the next era, the Golden Age under Suleiman the Magnificent, where the empire would reach the peak of political, cultural and military achievement. In 1451, the young Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne at just 19 years old, inheriting a realm already powerful but still seeking its defining moment. Unlike many rulers who rested on the accomplishments of predecessors, Mehmed possessed a vision that extended far beyond simple conquest. He understood that to cement the Ottoman Empire's place in history, he would need a victory that was both strategic and symbolic, one that would signal to the world that the Ottomans were no longer a regional power, but a force capable of shaping continents. Constantinople, the ancient capital of Byzantium, loomed as the prize that could accomplish this. For over 1,000 years, its massive walls had resisted invaders. Its strategic position controlling the Bosporus allowed it to dominate trade between Europe and Asia, and its wealth and culture made it a jewel few dared challenge. Yet Mehmed saw in its fall an opportunity to transform not only his empire, but the very balance of power in the medieval world. The young sultan did not rely solely on tradition or brute force. He meticulously planned the siege, employing engineers, architects and military strategists to design massive cannons capable of breaching the city's legendary walls. Ships were transported overland to bypass the chain-blocked harbor, demonstrating an ingenuity that would become a hallmark of Ottoman military strategy. Mehmed's army was disciplined, combining elite Janissary infantry, cavalry and skilled artillery units in a coordinated effort to ensure that each day of the siege brought the Ottomans closer to victory. Every detail was calculated: supply lines, morale, espionage and psychological warfare. For Mehmed, Constantinople was more than a city. It was the key to empire, the symbol of legitimacy, and the gateway to European dominance. April 6, 1453, marked the beginning of the siege. Over the next 53 days, Mehmed's forces bombarded the city relentlessly, their massive cannons shaking the walls that had withstood centuries of attacks. The Byzantines, led by Emperor Constantine XI, resisted valiantly, but the population was dwindling, supplies were scarce, and hope was fading. Each failed sally from the defenders only highlighted the Ottomans' discipline and coordination. The siege was not merely a battle of weapons, but a battle of wills, testing the resilience of both attackers and defenders. On May 29th, after weeks of relentless bombardment, tunneling and direct assaults, Mehmed's forces finally breached the Theodosian walls. Constantinople fell. Emperor Constantine XI disappeared in the chaos, and the city's defenders were overwhelmed. For the Ottomans, it was a triumph of planning, vision, and execution. For the world, it was a shock. A city that had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over a millennium had fallen to a previously peripheral power from Anatolia. The conquest sent ripples across Europe, altering trade, diplomacy and perceptions of military power. Mehmed II immediately set about transforming Constantinople into the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. The city was renamed Istanbul and became a hub for administration, culture, and commerce. Mehmed encouraged artisans, scholars, and merchants from across the empire and beyond to settle there, blending Byzantine traditions with Islamic architecture and Ottoman governance. Grand mosques, palaces, and public buildings were commissioned, demonstrating the empire's wealth, sophistication, and commitment to permanence. The conquest was not an act of mere plunder. It was the foundation for a flourishing imperial capital that would endure for centuries. The fall of Constantinople was also a turning point in military history. The success of the Ottoman siege demonstrated the effectiveness of gunpowder artillery against traditional fortifications, signaling a new era in warfare. European powers would struggle to adapt to this changing reality for decades, giving the Ottomans a strategic advantage that allowed further expansion into the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. Mehmed's victory was both immediate in its consequences and long-lasting in its influence on military doctrine and geopolitics. Yet Mehmed's genius extended beyond military might. He understood that conquest alone was insufficient without integration. He implemented policies that allowed the city's diverse population to maintain aspects of their previous lives, while integrating them into the Ottoman administrative and social system. Christians, Jews and Muslims all found roles within the city's structure, and their contributions to commerce, science and culture were encouraged. Mehmed's policies reinforced stability, demonstrating that the Ottomans were capable not only of taking cities, but also of sustaining them as thriving centers of civilization. The conquest also cemented the Ottoman Sultan's legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and rivals. Mehmed styled himself as the rightful ruler of both the former Byzantine lands and the Muslim world, claiming a mandate that combined religious authority with temporal power. The empire now had a capital that symbolized permanence, strength and sophistication, a city that would remain the heart of Ottoman administration and culture for the next 5 centuries. The implications of Constantinople's fall were profound. Trade routes shifted as European powers sought alternatives to Ottoman-controlled paths. Scholars fleeing the city helped spread classical knowledge throughout Italy, contributing to the Renaissance. Diplomatic relationships were recalibrated as neighboring powers realized that the Ottoman Empire was no longer a distant threat, but a dominant player in regional politics. Mehmed's victory reshaped the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, positioning the Ottomans as a central actor in global affairs. Mehmed's reign following the conquest was marked by continued expansion and consolidation. Territories in Anatolia, the Balkans, and the Aegean were systematically integrated into the empire, with administrative and military structures ensuring long-term stability. This period laid the foundation for what would become the empire's golden age under Suleiman the Magnificent, setting a standard for governance, military organization, and cultural patronage that defined the Ottomans for centuries. The fall of Constantinople was not simply a military triumph, it was a statement of vision, strategy, and foresight. It transformed the Ottomans from a rising power into an empire that would dominate continents, control trade, and influence cultures for generations. Mehmed II's achievement exemplified the combination of ambition, planning, and adaptability that had characterized Ottoman leadership since Osman I. From a small Anatolian tribe to the rulers of a global empire, the Ottomans had demonstrated that vision, coupled with action, could alter the course of history. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had transformed from a rising power into one of the most formidable states in the world. The reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, beginning in 1520, would become synonymous with the empire's golden age, a period marked by unparalleled military expansion, cultural flourishing, and sophisticated governance. Unlike his predecessors, Suleiman combined the ambition of a conqueror with the vision of a statesman, seeking not only territorial gain, but also internal stability and legal reform. His rule would define what it meant to be an Ottoman sultan and set a standard for leadership that resonated across centuries. Suleiman's early campaigns were as strategic as they were bold. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, a key fortress controlling the gateway to Hungary and Central Europe. 2 years later, in 1523, he secured Rhodes from the Knights of St. John, demonstrating the Ottomans' growing naval capabilities. These victories were not isolated events. They reflected a carefully calculated approach to expansion, one that prioritized control of trade routes, strategic fortresses, and influential cities. The empire's military was now a well-oiled machine, with elite janissaries forming the backbone of its disciplined and effective forces. Cavalry, artillery, and naval units worked in coordination, giving Suleiman an edge over both European and Middle Eastern rivals. Beyond the battlefield, Suleiman was a master administrator and legislator. He codified laws that addressed both civil and criminal matters, unifying a diverse population under a coherent legal system. His legal reforms were far-reaching, balancing Islamic principles with pragmatic governance. This codification, known as the Qanun, allowed for more predictable and fair administration across the empire's vast territories, fostering loyalty and stability. It also reflected Suleiman's understanding that lasting power depended not only on conquest, but on justice and effective governance. Cultural achievement flourished under Suleiman's rule. Architects like Mimar Sinan designed monumental mosques, bridges, and palaces, blending aesthetic brilliance with functional design. Art, literature, and scholarship thrived, attracting poets, scientists, and philosophers from across the empire. Istanbul, the empire's capital, became a vibrant hub of culture and commerce, a city that symbolized the empire's sophistication and diversity. Suleiman himself was a poet and patron of the arts, demonstrating that leadership in the Ottoman context extended beyond military might to intellectual and cultural influence. The empire's economy during this period was also robust and interconnected. Trade routes spanning from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, from Central Europe to the Arabian Peninsula, brought wealth and diversity to Ottoman cities. Markets were bustling with goods from distant lands, spices, textiles, metals, and more, while local artisans thrived under the protection and patronage of the state. This economic vitality allowed Suleiman to maintain a large, professional army and fund extensive public works, reinforcing the empire's stability and prestige. Suleiman's diplomacy was equally strategic. He maintained a complex network of alliances, rivalries, and treaties with European powers, including France, Venice, and the Habsburgs. His ability to navigate these relationships reflected both military confidence and political acumen. By balancing negotiation with force, Suleiman ensured that the empire could expand and protect its interests without overextending itself, a lesson in sustainable imperial strategy. Yet, Suleiman's reign was not without challenges. Internal rebellions, court intrigues, and succession disputes tested his leadership. The empire's diversity, while a strength, also demanded constant attention to maintain cohesion. Religious and ethnic tensions had to be carefully managed, and the Sultan's authority needed to be reinforced through both legal and symbolic means. Suleiman navigated these complexities with skill, often using a combination of patronage, appointments, and strategic marriages to maintain loyalty and stability. By mid-century, the Ottoman Empire had reached the peak of its territorial expansion. Campaigns in Hungary, Iraq, and North Africa extended its borders, while naval power in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea secured trade routes and deterred rivals. The empire's influence now stretched across 3 continents, affecting politics, commerce, and culture, from Vienna to Cairo, from Baghdad to the Aegean Islands. The world had to recognize that the Ottomans were not merely a regional power, they were a global empire. The Golden Age under Suleiman also highlighted the human dimension of empire. The Sultan's court was a center of learning and culture, attracting scholars, architects, and diplomats. Ordinary citizens benefited from improved infrastructure, justice, and economic opportunities. Cities grew, universities flourished, and arts and sciences advanced. This period showed that the Ottomans were capable not only of conquering lands, but of creating thriving, sustainable societies, a combination of ambition and governance that few empires could match. Suleiman's rule set a standard that influenced subsequent sultans. While future leaders would face different challenges, the principles of strategic military planning, careful administration, legal codification, and cultural patronage established during his reign became the template for maintaining Ottoman power. The empire's institutions, military organization, and cultural achievements during this period created a foundation that would endure for centuries, even as external pressures and internal weaknesses emerged in later generations. By the end of Suleiman's reign in 1566, the Ottoman Empire was at its zenith, territorially vast, economically prosperous, militarily dominant, and culturally vibrant. The achievements of this period were not the result of chance. They were the culmination of a centuries-long process of vision, strategy, and adaptation that began with Osman I and continued through Mehmed II. The Golden Age demonstrated the full potential of the empire, showing what could be accomplished when ambition, intelligence, and governance were aligned. The story of Suleiman's rule illustrates a crucial point. Empires are built not only through conquest, but through the integration of culture, law, economy, and society. The Ottomans under Suleiman achieved a rare balance between military might and civil administration, creating a legacy that influenced both the regions they controlled and the world beyond. Their example provides lessons on leadership, vision, and the sustainable exercise of power, lessons that resonate even in today's global context. Behind the grandeur of Suleiman's reign, beyond the armies, mosques, and markets, lay a world of intrigue that few outsiders ever understood: the Ottoman Palace. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul was not merely a residence for the Sultan. It was the heart of power, a city within a city where politics, religion, and family intersected in ways that could determine the fate of the entire empire. Within these walls, every decision was influenced not only by law or council, but by relationships, rivalries, and the ambitions of those closest to the Sultan. The harem, often misunderstood and misrepresented in Western accounts, was central to this web of influence. Far from being merely a place of leisure, it was a center of political strategy, education, and sometimes ruthless maneuvering. Women of the harem, particularly the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, wielded extraordinary power behind the scenes. They could influence appointments, advise on state matters, and, in certain periods, effectively control succession. During Suleiman's reign, Hürrem Sultan, a former concubine who became his legal wife, exemplified the political influence a woman could exert. She not only navigated the complex dynamics of the palace, but also acted as a patron of architecture, charity, and education, leaving a lasting mark on Istanbul and the empire. Her presence challenged the traditional notion that women in Ottoman society were powerless, showing that influence often operated through subtlety, intelligence, and strategic relationships. The harem also functioned as a school for future female leaders. Women were educated in language, literature, religion, and diplomacy, enabling them to advise, negotiate, and sometimes manipulate palace politics to protect their sons' interests or advance their family's position. This internal education helped ensure continuity of governance, especially when a young or inexperienced sultan ascended the throne. Many court decisions, from appointments of provincial governors to military campaigns, were subtly shaped by the women of the harem, who understood the delicate balance between power and loyalty. Outside the harem, palace officials known as viziers managed the empire's administration, but their authority was closely linked to the Sultan's favor. The Grand Vizier, in particular, acted as the Sultan's chief advisor and executive officer, overseeing everything from taxation to foreign diplomacy. These men were often selected from the devshirme system, converted Christian boys trained in both military and administrative disciplines, ensuring loyalty and competence. The combination of elite administrators and the subtle influence of palace women created a governance structure that, while opaque to outsiders, was remarkably effective. Decisions were made quickly, resources allocated efficiently, and dissent controlled before it could threaten stability. The interplay of power in the palace could also be deadly. Succession was never guaranteed, and the struggle to secure a sultanate could lead to intrigue, imprisonment, or assassination. Princes were often sent to govern distant provinces, learning leadership while staying under surveillance to prevent rebellion. The harem and court officials would sometimes align with or against a potential heir, making palace politics a critical determinant of the empire's future. Understanding the Ottoman court requires seeing beyond the stereotypes of opulence and indulgence. It was a place where political acumen, loyalty, and strategy were essential for survival. The physical layout of the palace reflected these power dynamics. Separate quarters, gated sections, and restricted access ensured that influence could be monitored and controlled. Every visitor, every petition, and every audience with the Sultan was filtered through a carefully managed hierarchy. This structure allowed Suleiman and his successors to govern an empire that spanned continents, while maintaining central control from Istanbul. The palace was both a fortress and a laboratory for governance, demonstrating the sophistication of Ottoman statecraft beyond the battlefield. The culture within the palace also reinforced the empire's identity. Art, literature, music, and religious practice were cultivated not just for pleasure, but to symbolize legitimacy and divine favor. Ceremonies, rituals, and public appearances communicated authority to subjects and rivals alike. The Sultan's presence was both symbolic and practical, reminding everyone that ultimate power rested with him, while advisors and the harem ensured that the mechanisms of government functioned smoothly. This balance between visible authority and behind-the-scenes influence was a key factor in the empire's ability to manage its vast territories for centuries. Even as the empire expanded into Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, the palace remained the nerve center. Messages from distant governors, intelligence about enemy movements, and reports on trade and taxation all passed through Istanbul. The Sultan's ability to assimilate this information and act decisively depended on the competence of his officials and the guidance he received from trusted members of the harem. The combination of centralized authority and distributed influence allowed the Ottomans to maintain cohesion in a diverse, multi-ethnic empire, a feat unmatched by many contemporary states. The story of the Ottoman palace and harem reveals that power was as much about strategy, intelligence, and relationships as it was about armies and territory. It demonstrates that the empire's strength was not solely in its conquests, but in the systems and structures that allowed it to govern millions of people effectively. Decisions made behind closed doors in Istanbul could have consequences felt thousands of miles away, shaping the social, political, and economic life of the empire in profound ways. The Ottoman military was more than an instrument of conquest. It was the foundation on which the empire's power rested. Central to this strength was the Janissary Corps, an elite army unlike any other in the medieval world. Established in the late 14th century and fully developed under Murad II and Mehmed II, the Janissaries were recruited through the devshirme system, in which Christian boys from the Balkans were taken, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained in both military discipline and administrative duties. This system ensured a highly loyal professional force, whose allegiance was to the Sultan rather than local lords or feudal networks, giving the Ottomans an unparalleled advantage in both battlefield coordination and political stability. The training of a Janissary began from a young age, focusing not only on combat skills with swords, bows and firearms, but also on discipline, obedience and strategic thinking. Their education included mathematics, literacy and military tactics, producing soldiers capable of independent judgment on the battlefield. This blend of intellectual and physical rigor made them a uniquely adaptable force, capable of both offensive campaigns and complex siege operations. The Janissaries were instrumental in key battles, including the capture of Constantinople, where their discipline and coordination under Mehmed II proved decisive against the city's formidable defenses. Beyond their military prowess, the Janissaries were integrated into the Ottoman administrative structure. Many rose to influential positions, acting as governors, tax collectors, or military commanders in distant provinces. This dual role as both soldier and administrator reinforced the central authority of the Sultan and allowed the Ottomans to maintain control over vast and culturally diverse territories. The core also became a social institution with its own hierarchy, traditions and identity, fostering loyalty and cohesion within the empire. The innovation of the Janissaries lay not only in recruitment and training, but in their tactical application. They combined infantry firepower with artillery support and cavalry maneuvers, often adapting European and Middle Eastern strategies to suit the unique challenges of the battlefield. Their discipline contrasted sharply with the fragmented feudal armies of Europe, enabling coordinated campaigns across multiple theaters. Battles in the Balkans, Hungary, and later the Middle East demonstrated the strategic superiority that this professional army afforded the empire. However, the Janissaries were more than an army. They were a symbol of Ottoman power and authority. Their presence alone could deter rebellion and consolidate control over newly conquered lands. They were the visible enforcers of the Sultan's will, projecting power while maintaining internal order. Over time, their influence extended beyond the military, affecting politics within the palace and the broader empire. The core's leaders could negotiate with the Sultan, influence appointments, and even challenge authority, demonstrating the complex interplay between military strength and political power in the Ottoman system. The Ottoman approach to military organization reflected a broader philosophy of statecraft. Combine innovation, loyalty, and adaptability to create a sustainable system of power. Unlike many contemporary armies, which relied heavily on mercenaries or feudal levies, the Janissaries were a permanent institution, trained, disciplined, and ideologically aligned with the state. This continuity allowed the Ottomans to maintain a competitive edge over European powers for centuries and contributed to the empire's ability to project influence across 3 continents. Naval power was another pillar of Ottoman military strength. The conquest of key ports in the Mediterranean, such as Rhodes and later Cyprus, demonstrated the empire's ability to project force across seas, secure trade routes, and challenge maritime powers like Venice and Genoa. Ottoman shipyards produced powerful galleys, equipped for both combat and transport, supporting campaigns that extended the empire's reach into North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Coordination between naval and land forces reflected the strategic sophistication that characterized Ottoman military planning during its peak. The effectiveness of the Janissaries and the Ottoman military also reinforced the empire's internal governance. Provinces far from Istanbul were governed with the knowledge that the Sultan could rely on a disciplined army to enforce authority if local officials or populations challenged central rule. This allowed for a balance between local autonomy and imperial oversight, reducing the need for constant direct intervention while maintaining cohesion across culturally and geographically diverse territories. Over time, the Janissaries became an integral part of Ottoman identity. Their uniforms, rituals, and loyalty to the Sultan distinguished them from ordinary soldiers and created a sense of elite status. Yet their power also created tension. Their involvement in politics sometimes led to instability, demonstrating the delicate balance between military strength and governance. Nevertheless, during the height of the empire, their effectiveness both on the battlefield and within the administrative framework contributed to the Ottomans' reputation as a disciplined, strategic and enduring power. By combining innovative recruitment, rigorous training and strategic deployment, the Janissaries exemplified the Ottoman approach to power, a fusion of military might, political control, and social integration. They were not simply warriors, they were the backbone of an empire that required both force and intelligence to govern effectively. Their legacy endured for centuries, influencing not only Ottoman military practice, but also the broader understanding of professional standing armies in Europe and Asia. The Ottoman Empire's strength was not only measured by its armies or administrative skill, but also by its extraordinary capacity to generate wealth, sustain trade, and foster scientific and cultural advancement. Stretching across 3 continents, it controlled vital trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa, positioning the empire as a central hub in a global network centuries before globalization became a concept. Cities like Istanbul, Bursa, and Aleppo thrived as commercial centers where merchants from Venice, Genoa, Persia, and India converged to exchange goods, ideas, and innovations. Spices, textiles, metals, and luxury items flowed along these routes, fueling the empire's coffers and supporting both military campaigns and monumental public works. The Ottomans understood the economic power of geography. The Bosporus, Dardanelles, and key Balkan passes were not merely strategic military points, they were also gateways controlling commerce. By levying taxes, regulating trade, and establishing caravanserais for merchants, the empire transformed these routes into reliable revenue streams. This economic foresight allowed the sultans to finance standing armies, support cultural institutions, and build infrastructures such as bridges, mosques, and marketplaces that reinforced both stability and prosperity. Wealth was not hoarded but circulated, creating a dynamic economy capable of supporting an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. Scientific advancement flourished alongside economic growth. Astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and medicine were cultivated under state patronage. Scholars translated texts from Arabic, Persian, and Greek into Ottoman Turkish, preserving knowledge while creating innovations in architecture, navigation, and artillery design. Mimar Sinan, the chief architect under Suleiman the Magnificent, designed monumental structures that combined aesthetic brilliance with engineering mastery, reflecting the empire's integration of art, science, and functionality. These achievements were not mere displays of wealth. They reinforced the empire's identity, projecting power, sophistication, and legitimacy to both subjects and rivals. Trade networks connected not only cities within the empire, but also distant regions. Ottoman merchants acted as intermediaries between Europe and Asia, supplying silk, spices, and other commodities that were in high demand across the continent. This economic interdependence gave the empire leverage over European powers and provided resilience against local shortages or political upheavals. Markets became spaces of cultural exchange as much as commerce, introducing new ideas, technologies, and customs that enriched Ottoman society and helped it adapt to an ever-changing world. Agriculture remained the backbone of the empire's economy. Fertile lands in Anatolia, the Balkans, and Egypt produced grain, cotton, and other essential crops, sustaining urban populations and armies alike. The state implemented systems of land tenure and taxation that balanced the needs of peasants with the requirements of central authority, ensuring productivity while maintaining social stability. Irrigation projects, road networks, and bridges facilitated both trade and military movement, demonstrating the Ottomans' ability to integrate economic planning with governance and defense. The empire also became a center for craftsmanship and industry. Textile production, metalwork, ceramics, and shipbuilding flourished under both private artisans and state-sponsored workshops. Luxury goods from Ottoman workshops were exported to Europe and Asia, creating both wealth and cultural prestige. This craftsmanship was often intertwined with science and engineering, as innovations in metallurgy, navigation, and mechanics enhanced both civilian and military capabilities. Cultural and economic interconnections strengthened social cohesion across the empire's diverse population. Merchants, scholars, artisans, and religious communities interacted in ways that encouraged loyalty, knowledge sharing, and stability. The millet system, which allowed different religious groups to govern themselves in matters of personal law, complemented economic integration, ensuring that communities could prosper without unnecessary interference while remaining aligned with imperial interests. This balance of autonomy and oversight was a hallmark of Ottoman governance, allowing trade, science, and culture to flourish alongside military and political expansion. The empire's wealth also allowed for ambitious infrastructure projects that further reinforced both commerce and imperial control. Roads and bridges facilitated movement of goods and armies, while caravanserais provided safe lodging for travelers, traders, and officials. Ports and shipyards enhanced naval capabilities, securing maritime trade and projecting Ottoman influence across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and beyond. Cities were designed not merely as administrative centers, but as living hubs that reflected the empire's sophistication, power, and cultural diversity. Education and intellectual life were supported by institutions like madrasas, which trained scholars, bureaucrats, and religious leaders. Libraries, observatories, and medical schools fostered innovation while preserving and expanding existing knowledge. This intellectual infrastructure reinforced governance, military planning, and cultural identity, ensuring that the empire's power was grounded not only in force but also in wisdom and expertise. By connecting three continents through trade, culture, and knowledge, the Ottoman Empire created a system that was both resilient and expansive. Its economic, scientific, and cultural networks sustained military campaigns, supported urban growth, and reinforced political legitimacy. The empire's ability to integrate diverse peoples, facilitate exchange, and encourage innovation was as crucial to its longevity as the discipline of its armies or the skill of its sultans. Understanding the Ottoman Empire's economy and intellectual life reveals that power is multidimensional. Military conquest secures territory, but sustained dominance depends on wealth, infrastructure, knowledge, and the ability to govern complex societies effectively. The Ottomans excelled in all these areas, creating an empire that could endure centuries of internal and external pressures while continuing to innovate, adapt, and prosper. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, cracks began to appear in the Ottoman Empire's seemingly invincible structure. While the empire had reached its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent, subsequent sultans struggled to replicate his vision, discipline, and administrative acumen. Succession disputes, palace intrigues, and the growing power of factions within the harem and the janissaries introduced instability at the heart of governance. Young or incompetent sultans often relied heavily on advisors, while ambitious officials maneuvered for influence, sometimes undermining central authority. The careful balance that had allowed the empire to expand and govern effectively now faced unprecedented strain. The devshirme system, once the engine of military loyalty and competence, began to falter. By the 17th century, recruitment practices shifted, and the janissaries became less disciplined, more entrenched, and increasingly involved in politics. They began to resist reforms, demand privileges, and even depose sultans, turning what had once been a tool of stability into a source of internal tension. Military inefficiency, combined with an increasingly corrupt bureaucracy, meant that governors and provincial leaders often acted in their own interest rather than that of the empire. These internal weaknesses left the state vulnerable to both domestic unrest and external threats. Economic challenges compounded the empire's problems. Inflation, partly driven by the influx of New World silver into European markets, destabilized currency and trade. European maritime powers, particularly the Dutch, English, and Portuguese, began bypassing Ottoman-controlled land routes, redirecting trade to the seas and weakening the empire's monopoly on long-distance commerce. Agricultural production faced difficulties due to overtaxation, land disputes, and occasional droughts, reducing revenues and straining the state's ability to maintain armies and infrastructure. Cities that had once flourished as trade hubs experienced slowdowns, and artisans and merchants found themselves increasingly constrained by bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption. Religious and social tensions also surfaced. While the millet system had provided a framework for managing a multi-religious empire, rising conservatism and factionalism sometimes inflamed local disputes. In some regions, local elites resisted central authority, undermining the sultan's control. Peasant revolts and urban unrest became more frequent, reflecting both economic hardship and dissatisfaction with imperial governance. Maintaining loyalty required constant attention, negotiation, and increasingly military intervention. External pressures intensified these internal challenges. European powers, particularly the Habsburgs and the rising maritime states of Spain and Portugal, challenged Ottoman dominance in both the Mediterranean and Central Europe. Wars over territories in Hungary, the Balkans, and the Mediterranean drained the empire's resources and exposed military vulnerabilities. Campaigns that might have once been straightforward victories now became prolonged conflicts, taxing both finances and morale. In the east, the Safavids in Persia remained a persistent rival, engaging in intermittent warfare that further stretched the empire's military capabilities. Corruption and inefficiency permeated the administration. Provincial governors often prioritized personal enrichment over imperial loyalty, and tax collection became inconsistent and oppressive. This not only reduced revenue but fueled resentment among local populations. Attempts at reform were met with resistance from entrenched interests, particularly within the Janissary corps and the palace bureaucracy. Even the Sultan's authority, once absolute, was sometimes circumvented by powerful advisors or rebellious factions, illustrating that the empire's strength now depended on negotiation and compromise as much as on military might. Despite these challenges, the empire retained resilience. The Ottoman state had built-in mechanisms for absorbing shocks, a professional bureaucracy, a disciplined military, though increasingly strained, and a flexible approach to religious and cultural diversity. Local autonomy, while sometimes a source of tension, allowed the empire to maintain control over vast territories without constant direct intervention. Even in decline, the Ottomans could marshal resources, reform institutions, and adapt to changing circumstances in ways that many European states could not. The 17th century witnessed several key episodes highlighting both vulnerability and resilience. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 marked a turning point in European-Ottoman relations, signaling that the empire could no longer project unlimited power into Central Europe. Yet the Ottomans survived politically and militarily, renegotiating borders, fortifying cities, and maintaining influence over the Mediterranean and the Middle East. These adaptations reflected a capacity for survival even as expansion slowed and decline became increasingly apparent. Internal reforms were attempted sporadically. Efforts to modernize the military, streamline bureaucracy, and stabilize finances were met with mixed results, often hampered by entrenched interests and the empire's sheer size. Some sultans, recognizing the challenges, sought to centralize authority and curb corruption, but success was limited. These measures highlight the tension between innovation and tradition, a recurring theme in the later centuries of Ottoman history. By the early 18th century, the Ottoman Empire had entered a period historians often call the era of stagnation. Territorial losses were slow but cumulative, administrative inefficiency persisted, and economic adaptation lagged behind European competitors. Yet the empire remained a formidable presence, capable of projecting power, maintaining internal cohesion, and influencing regional politics. Its legacy, built over centuries of conquest, administration, and cultural achievement, was still evident in cities, trade networks, and institutions. Understanding the empire's gradual decline requires recognizing the complexity of its challenges. Internal corruption, succession crises, and bureaucratic inefficiency were compounded by external pressures from rising European powers. Yet the Ottomans' ability to survive these pressures for centuries demonstrates a remarkable resilience rooted in centuries of institution building, adaptability, and cultural integration. Even in decline, the empire remained a central actor in global politics, shaping events far beyond its borders. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire, once the unchallenged giant of 3 continents, was increasingly labeled the sick man of Europe. Centuries of military success, administrative pacification, and economic dominance had given way to stagnation, territorial loss, and internal unrest. The empire faced pressures from nationalist movements, European colonial ambitions, and rapid modernization in the West. Territories that had been loyal for generations, Greece, Serbia, and Egypt, began seeking independence, testing the Sultan's ability to maintain control over a vast, multi-ethnic state. The 1821 Greek War of Independence was a dramatic turning point. After centuries under Ottoman rule, Greeks rebelled, inspired by nationalism and encouraged by European powers sympathetic to their cause. The revolt was brutal, marked by massacres on both sides, yet it revealed a vulnerability that had been growing unnoticed. Centralized authority could no longer fully suppress determined nationalist movements. International intervention, particularly from Britain, France, and Russia, ensured Greek independence in 1832, signaling to the world that the empire could no longer dictate outcomes unilaterally. Meanwhile, internal reforms, known as the Tanzimat, beginning in 1839, sought to modernize the empire in response to both internal and external threats. These reforms aimed to centralize administration, standardize taxation, modernize the army, and codify legal rights for all subjects, regardless of religion. While ambitious, these reforms faced significant resistance from conservative factions within the palace, the janissaries, and local elites. Some measures were successful, particularly in restructuring the bureaucracy and army, but the underlying structural weaknesses of the empire remained unresolved. Territorial losses accelerated during this period. The Crimean War, 1853-1856, highlighted both the empire's strategic importance and its military vulnerabilities. Allied with Britain and France against Russia, the Ottomans relied heavily on European support to defend territory in the Black Sea region. While the war prevented Russian expansion, it underscored the empire's dependence on foreign powers for survival, a stark contrast to the self-sufficient military dominance of the 16th century. Economic pressures compounded these political challenges. European industrialization and the rise of global trade networks increasingly marginalized Ottoman markets. Traditional crafts and local industries struggled to compete with imported goods, while foreign loans and debt created dependency on European banks. Railroads and telegraphs, while modernizing some aspects of infrastructure, also facilitated European influence and control over commerce. The empire's economy became increasingly intertwined with and vulnerable to the dynamics of global capitalism. Nationalist movements continued to fragment the empire. Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and later Albania and the Arab provinces began to assert independence throughout the 19th century. These movements were fueled by ethnic identity, local leadership, and encouragement from European powers seeking to weaken Ottoman influence. Each successful rebellion eroded the empire's territorial integrity and prestige, creating a cycle of instability that proved difficult to reverse. The late 19th and early 20th centuries brought additional challenges with the rise of new military threats and internal dissent. The Balkan Wars, 1912–1913, resulted in the loss of nearly all Ottoman territories in Europe, further shrinking the empire and demonstrating that its military could no longer project power effectively beyond Anatolia. World War I would deliver the final blow. The Ottomans sided with the Central Powers, hoping to regain lost territories and reassert influence, but defeat led to occupation, division, and the disintegration of centuries of imperial authority. Amid these crises, the rise of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and the Turkish nationalist movement marked the final transformation. Between 1919 and 1923, the remnants of the empire were reorganized into a modern nation-state. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 officially recognized the Republic of Turkey, ending the Ottoman Sultanate and replacing centuries of imperial rule with a secular, centralized government. Atatürk's reforms, modernization of the legal system, adoption of the Latin alphabet, and industrialization reflected a decisive break from the Ottoman past. Yet the legacy of the empire's governance, culture, and strategic vision continued to influence the new state. The decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire illustrate the complex interplay of internal weaknesses and external pressures. A once dominant power built on military innovation, administrative sophistication, and cultural integration, gradually succumbed to nationalism, economic marginalization, and global geopolitical shifts. Yet the empire's legacy endures in modern Turkey, in architecture, language, cuisine, and the memory of a civilization that connected continents, peoples, and cultures for over 6 centuries. The cultural and artistic achievements of the Ottoman Empire were as remarkable as its military conquests and administrative prowess. Even as political power fluctuated, the empire cultivated a vibrant civilization that blended influences from the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, creating a unique Ottoman identity. Architecture was perhaps the most visible testament to this legacy. Under the guidance of architects like Mimar Sinan, the empire produced monumental mosques, bridges, and palaces that combined functionality with aesthetic grandeur. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, completed in 1557, exemplifies this fusion. Soaring domes, elegant minarets, and intricately decorated interiors reflected both religious devotion and imperial authority. Ottoman art extended beyond architecture to miniature painting, calligraphy, ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. Manuscripts were illuminated with meticulous attention to detail, often depicting historical events, daily life, or religious stories in vibrant colors. Calligraphy became a highly respected art form, adorning mosques, palaces, and public buildings with inscriptions of Quranic verses, poetry, and imperial decrees. This integration of art with public and religious spaces reinforced both cultural identity and state authority. Textiles and ceramics were significant, not only for their beauty, but also for their economic and diplomatic value. Ottoman carpets, silk, and embroidered fabrics were exported across Europe and Asia, becoming symbols of luxury and taste. Iznik pottery, with its distinctive cobalt blue and turquoise designs, adorned palaces and mosques, demonstrating technical mastery and aesthetic sophistication. These artistic productions were often sponsored by the Sultan, the court, or wealthy patrons, highlighting the close relationship between culture and power in the empire. Music and literature flourished as well. Ottoman classical music evolved through the fusion of Persian, Arabic, and Turkic traditions, with compositions performed in the palace, mosques, and public celebrations. Poets and scholars wrote in Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic, producing works that explored philosophy, history, love, and religion. Literary salons and scholarly institutions became centers of intellectual exchange, ensuring that ideas circulated throughout the empire. This cultural vibrancy helped unify a diverse population, providing shared symbols and narratives that reinforced Ottoman identity. The empire also excelled in practical sciences. Advances in engineering, medicine, astronomy, and cartography were often directly linked to state needs. Engineers designed innovative military fortifications, bridges, and water systems. Physicians served both the palace and public hospitals, and astronomers contributed to navigation and calendar reform. Knowledge was preserved, adapted, and disseminated across generations, reflecting an approach that valued both tradition and innovation. Education played a central role in sustaining this cultural dynamism. Madras provided instruction in religious studies, law, and the sciences, training scholars, bureaucrats, and administrators capable of serving the state. Libraries and observatories became centers of learning, often attached to mosques or palaces. By fostering intellectual development alongside artistic and architectural achievement, the Ottomans created a civilization that was both aesthetically refined and practically effective. Public spaces reflected this synthesis of culture and governance. Markets, caravanserais, baths, and fountains were constructed not only to serve practical needs, but also to display imperial generosity and sophistication. Festivals, religious ceremonies, and public celebrations reinforced social cohesion while showcasing the wealth, power, and cultural sophistication of the state. Through these activities, ordinary citizens experienced a sense of participation in the empire's grandeur, linking daily life to broader imperial narratives. Even as political decline set in during the 18th and 19th centuries, Ottoman cultural achievements continued to influence society and neighboring regions. European travelers, diplomats, and artists marveled at the empire's architecture, crafts, and scholarly institutions, bringing Ottoman ideas, designs, and techniques back to their homelands. The empire's cultural legacy, therefore, extended far beyond its political borders, shaping art, architecture, literature, and thought across continents. The Ottoman approach to culture illustrates that power is not solely about military might or administrative control. It is also about creating a shared identity, fostering innovation, and leaving a tangible mark on society. Architecture, art, music, literature, and science were not merely embellishments, they were tools of governance, instruments of diplomacy, and markers of legitimacy. In this way, the Ottomans ensured that their civilization would endure in memory, influence, and material culture long after their political dominance waned. Religion was a cornerstone of the Ottoman Empire, shaping governance, society, and identity. The empire was officially Islamic, with the Sultan holding the dual role of political ruler and Caliph, the leader of the Muslim world. Yet from its earliest expansion, The Ottomans governed a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population, including Christians, Jews, and various sects of Islam. Rather than attempt forced homogenization, the Ottomans implemented a pragmatic system known as the millet system, which allowed religious communities a degree of autonomy in exchange for loyalty to the state. Each millet or religious community was responsible for its own civil law, education, and religious institutions. Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, and Jews had their own courts and leaders who communicated with the Sultan's administration on behalf of their communities. This arrangement reduced friction, allowed for more efficient governance, and ensured that diverse groups could coexist under imperial authority. It also fostered a sense of belonging and stability, as communities could maintain their traditions, language, and religious practices while contributing to the empire's economy and administration. The millet system reflected the Ottomans' broader philosophy of power, flexibility combined with central oversight. By decentralizing certain aspects of governance while retaining ultimate authority in Istanbul, the Sultan ensured loyalty, minimized rebellion, and maintained social cohesion. Religious leaders became intermediaries, mediating between their communities and the state, which allowed the empire to manage its vast territories with remarkable efficiency. This approach contrasted sharply with the more centralized or coercive models of rule found in contemporary European empires, giving the Ottomans a distinct advantage in administering diverse populations. Religious policy also intersected with law and education. Islamic law guided civil, criminal, and commercial matters for Muslim subjects, while non-Muslim communities followed their own legal codes under the millet framework. Madrasas educated Muslim scholars, judges, and administrators, while Christian and Jewish schools trained leaders within their communities. This balance of religious authority and legal pluralism helped maintain order, prevent systemic alienation, and reinforce the Sultan's legitimacy as both a political and spiritual leader. Tolerance had limits, of course. Periods of tension, taxation disputes, and local uprisings occasionally erupted, but these were often localized and managed without undermining imperial cohesion. The empire's approach was less about idealized religious pluralism and more about practical governance, allowing communities enough autonomy to function while ensuring that loyalty to the Sultan remained paramount. This pragmatic balance allowed the Ottomans to govern millions across Anatolia, the Balkans, the Levant, and North Africa. Religious institutions also played a role in legitimizing the Sultan's authority. Mosque complexes, madrasas, and charitable foundations, waqfs, were not merely spiritual centers. They were also tools for social welfare, education, and public influence. By funding these institutions, the Sultan projected both piety and power, reinforcing his dual role as religious and temporal leader. Public ceremonies, Friday prayers, and religious festivals further integrated imperial authority with daily life, creating a social fabric in which the Sultan's presence and influence were ever present. The empire's approach to religious diversity contributed to its longevity. By combining Islamic law with practical tolerance, decentralization, and institutional flexibility, the Ottomans managed tensions that might have destabilized a less sophisticated state. The millet system became a model of coexistence for other multi-ethnic empires and influenced governance strategies well beyond the Ottoman borders. Religion also shaped cultural and intellectual life. Islamic scholarship thrived alongside Christian and Jewish intellectual traditions, producing advances in science, philosophy, literature, and the arts. This cross-pollination of ideas strengthened the empire's cultural vibrancy and reinforced its position as a center of learning and innovation. Religion was both a unifying force and a framework for pragmatic administration, demonstrating that governance in the Ottoman Empire was as much about managing belief as it was about commanding armies or collecting taxes. The legacy of Ottoman religious governance endures in modern Turkey and the broader Middle East. While the empire itself no longer exists, its strategies for managing diversity, balancing local autonomy with central authority, and integrating religious institutions into governance left lasting marks on administrative practice and cultural identity. The Ottoman Empire's longevity was not only built on military strength and internal governance, but also on a sophisticated approach to diplomacy and foreign policy. From its earliest expansion into Europe and the Middle East, the empire understood that power extended beyond the battlefield. Diplomacy, alliances, and calculated engagement with rival states were essential to protecting borders, securing trade routes, and projecting influence across continents. The Ottomans were adept at balancing intimidation with negotiation, using both hard and soft power to maintain their position as a central player in global affairs. In Europe, the Ottomans maintained a complex relationship with the Habsburgs, Venice, and other regional powers. Wars were frequent, but so were alliances and treaties. The empire leveraged its military might to extract favorable terms, while simultaneously engaging in trade and diplomacy to stabilize volatile borders. Treaties such as the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, though marking territorial losses, also demonstrated the Ottomans' ability to negotiate and survive politically in a shifting European landscape. European powers recognized that outright conquest of Ottoman lands was difficult, so they often sought treaties and alliances to manage tensions, acknowledging the empire's continued significance. The empire's interactions were not limited to Europe. Relations with Persia, under the Safavid and later Qajar dynasties, shaped politics in the Middle East for centuries. Frequent wars over territories like Mesopotamia alternated with periods of trade and diplomacy, reflecting a pragmatic approach to regional rivalry. Similarly, relations with North African states and Arabian tribes involved a combination of tribute, military support, and political alliances, allowing the Ottomans to maintain influence across a diverse and often decentralized region. Naval diplomacy was equally important. Control of the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Black Sea was contested with maritime powers like Venice, Genoa, and later Portugal. Ottoman naval forces, combined with strategic ports and fortifications, allowed the empire to protect trade routes, exert influence over islands and coastal cities, and engage in power projection far from the Anatolian heartland. Treaties and maritime agreements with European powers often accompanied these military efforts, ensuring that diplomacy and force worked hand in hand. Trade and diplomacy were deeply intertwined. Ottoman envoys maintained contact with European courts, negotiating trade privileges, protection for merchants, and access to strategic resources. Similarly, European states established permanent embassies in Istanbul, recognizing the Sultan's central role in regional politics. This constant exchange of information, gifts, and negotiation helped the Ottomans stay informed about European politics, allowing them to respond strategically to shifting alliances, wars, and economic pressures. The Ottomans were also skilled at using symbolic diplomacy, hosting foreign dignitaries in lavish ceremonies, sending gifts, and participating in shared religious and cultural practices reinforced the empire's prestige. Diplomacy was not purely transactional, it was performative, projecting power, wealth, and sophistication, while subtly asserting the Sultan's authority over both allies and rivals. This combination of practical negotiation and symbolic display helped maintain the empire's influence even during periods of military stagnation or economic challenge. During periods of decline, diplomacy became even more critical. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the empire confronting the rising power of European states, the spread of nationalism, and internal unrest. Strategic treaties, alliances, and managed conflicts allowed the Ottomans to delay territorial losses and maintain a degree of sovereignty, while European industrialization and naval superiority increasingly pressured the empire. Ottoman statesmen leveraged diplomacy to buy time, secure resources, and attempt internal reforms that might stabilize the state. The empire's approach to diplomacy reflected a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of global power. Military victories alone could not ensure survival. Trade, alliances, marriage, negotiation, and symbolic gestures were all tools in the Ottoman arsenal. This multidimensional strategy allowed the empire to navigate centuries of shifting power dynamics, from the rise of European colonial empires to the complex politics of the Middle East and North Africa. Ottoman foreign policy also left a lasting legacy on international relations, their methods combining hard power, economic leverage, and cultural diplomacy anticipated modern approaches to statecraft. Envoys, treaties, and diplomatic networks became institutionalized, creating a professionalized diplomatic corps that influenced European and Middle Eastern states alike. The empire's ability to maintain influence despite military and economic pressures demonstrates the sophistication and resilience of its political strategy. The Ottoman Empire's administrative and legal systems were central to its ability to govern a vast, diverse territory stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts. Unlike many contemporary states, the Ottomans developed a highly structured bureaucracy that balanced central authority with local autonomy, ensuring stability across regions with varying cultures, religions, and economic systems. This sophisticated governance allowed the empire to endure for centuries despite internal and external pressures. At the heart of this system was the Sultan, whose authority combined political, military, and religious power. He was the ultimate legislator, judge, and military commander, yet he relied heavily on a network of advisors, officials, and administrators to execute daily governance. The Grand Vizier, as the Sultan's chief executive, managed civil administration, supervised provincial governors, and coordinated military campaigns. This hierarchical system ensured that decisions could be implemented efficiently while preserving the Sultan's ultimate control. Provincial governance was carefully organized to maintain both local order and loyalty to the central state. Governors, known as beys or pashas, were appointed to oversee districts, collect taxes, maintain security, and enforce laws. While they enjoyed significant autonomy in managing day-to-day affairs, their authority was constrained by oversight from Istanbul. Periodic inspections, reports, and rotation of officials minimized corruption and prevented local power bases from challenging the Sultan. This balance between local autonomy and central control was critical for governing diverse populations spread across mountains, rivers, and deserts. The Ottoman legal system combined Islamic law, Sharia, with secular regulations known as Kanun. Sharia guided personal, criminal, and civil matters for Muslim subjects, while Kanun, developed over centuries, addressed taxation, land tenure, military service, and administrative procedures. This dual system allowed the empire to adapt to practical governance needs without undermining religious legitimacy. Courts and judges, or qadis, applied these laws, ensuring fairness while reinforcing the Sultan's authority. Non-Muslim communities were often governed by their own religious laws under the millet system, maintaining social cohesion and stability. Taxation and land management were also central to administrative control. The empire relied on a combination of direct taxation, land leases, and agricultural assessments to generate revenue. Large estates, often controlled by military officers or religious endowments, were integrated into the state's fiscal system. This approach allowed the empire to support its army, fund infrastructure, and maintain urban centers while providing incentives for agricultural productivity and trade. Administrative innovations such as standardized tax registers and local courts helped maintain consistency and reduce corruption. Military administration was closely tied to governance. The janissaries and provincial militias were not only combat forces but also instruments of political control. Their organization and loyalty reinforced the Sultan's authority across distant provinces. Local officials coordinated with military units to suppress rebellion, defend borders, and maintain order, illustrating the integration of military and civil governance in Ottoman administration. The bureaucracy also emphasized meritocracy to an extent rare for the time. Officials recruited through the devshirme system or trained in madrasas could rise to positions of significant influence based on competence and loyalty. This system ensured that administrative and military leadership was professionalized, reducing the risk of nepotism or incompetence undermining governance. Even when corruption or inefficiency occurred, the institutional structure allowed for reforms, oversight and replacement of underperforming officials. Communication and record-keeping were vital for cohesion. Letters, edicts, and reports traveled along well-maintained routes, allowing the central government to respond to crises, manage finances, and coordinate military campaigns effectively. The empire's ability to process information and enforce policies across vast distances was a critical factor in its longevity. This combination of legal sophistication, hierarchical administration, and bureaucratic professionalism allowed the Ottoman Empire to integrate diverse populations, manage complex economies, and sustain military power. It also provided resilience during periods of political weakness or external threat, demonstrating that governance in the Ottoman context was as much about institutional design as it was about leadership or conquest. The Ottoman Empire's military history is a story of both brilliance and eventual limitation, spanning centuries of campaigns across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. From its earliest expansion, the empire relied on disciplined armies, strategic planning, and innovative tactics to outmaneuver larger or better-equipped foes. Battles were fought not only with swords and cannons, but with careful coordination, logistics, and intelligence, elements that allowed a relatively small corps of troops, particularly the janissaries, to achieve victories against formidable opponents. One of the empire's most famous early triumphs was the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, employed both overwhelming artillery and strategic deception to breach the city's formidable walls. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military victory. It was a psychological blow to Europe and a transformative moment in history. The city became Istanbul, the empire's new capital, symbolizing Ottoman strength and signaling a new era in global trade, politics, and culture. Following this, the Ottomans expanded into the Balkans and Eastern Europe, engaging in wars with Hungary, Poland, and the Habsburgs. These campaigns showcased not only battlefield prowess, but also strategic governance. Conquered territories were integrated into the empire through a combination of local autonomy, taxation, and military oversight. The Ottomans understood that holding land required more than conquest. It demanded administration, diplomacy, and the maintenance of social order. Naval power became increasingly important as the empire confronted European maritime states. The Mediterranean was a contested arena, with Venice, Genoa, and later Spain challenging Ottoman dominance. Victories like the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, while a setback, did not eliminate Ottoman naval influence. The empire adapted by building new fleets, fortifying ports, and negotiating alliances, demonstrating resilience and strategic flexibility in the face of changing technologies and European naval expansion. In the East, Campaigns against Persia under the Safavids highlighted the empire's ability to operate on multiple fronts. These wars, fought over strategic territories and religious influence, required coordination across difficult terrain and the deployment of both elite and provincial forces. The Ottomans used a combination of diplomacy, fortifications, and tactical maneuvers to manage these conflicts, often reaching negotiated settlements that preserved imperial authority while limiting protracted bloodshed. The 17th century introduced new challenges. The Siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the limit of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. While the siege failed, it reflected the empire's continued ambition and military capacity, even as European powers began to industrialize and innovate in ways that gradually outpaced Ottoman methods. Subsequent conflicts in the Balkans, the Mediterranean, and the Caucasus demonstrated both resilience and growing vulnerabilities as logistics, internal dissent, and resource limitations increasingly constrained military campaigns. The 18th and 19th centuries were marked by defensive warfare and attempts at modernization. European powers, particularly Austria, Russia, and Britain, challenged Ottoman borders with superior technology and organization. The empire responded with military reforms, including modernized artillery, new infantry training, and the restructuring of elite units. While these reforms temporarily bolstered capabilities, they often faced resistance from conservative factions, illustrating the tension between tradition and adaptation. World War I represented the empire's final major military engagement. Aligning with the Central Powers, the Ottomans fought on multiple fronts, from the deserts of the Middle East to the mountains of the Caucasus. Battles such as Gallipoli in 1915 demonstrated courage, strategy, and resilience against well-equipped opponents, leaving a legacy of heroism that would resonate in Turkish national memory. Yet the strain of global war, combined with internal unrest and external intervention, ultimately led to defeat, occupation, and the disintegration of imperial authority. Across centuries, Ottoman military strategy blended flexibility, discipline, and innovation. The empire adapted to changing technologies, diverse terrain, and complex political landscapes, allowing it to control vast territories for centuries. While ultimate defeat came in the 20th century, the record of victories, campaigns, and strategic governance underscores the empire's enduring role as a formidable military and political power. Ottoman society was a complex tapestry of cultures, religions, and social classes, yet it maintained cohesion through a combination of legal structures, communal organization, and shared identity under the Sultan. Daily life varied dramatically depending on region, religion, and social status, but common threads, commerce, education, religion, and family connected the diverse population and reinforced the empire's stability. Cities like Istanbul, Cairo, and Baghdad were vibrant centers where merchants, artisans, scholars, and officials interacted, creating dynamic social and economic networks. The family was a cornerstone of Ottoman social life. Households were typically patriarchal, with extended families living together, supporting one another, and transmitting traditions. Education began at home for young children, emphasizing religion, literacy, and practical skills. Boys might continue formal schooling in madrasas, learning law, science, and administration, while girls were educated in domestic management, religious practice, and sometimes literature or music. These foundations reinforced social cohesion and prepared the next generation for roles in governance, trade, or community leadership. Urban life was marked by bustling markets, mosques, baths, and public spaces that fostered interaction across classes and ethnicities. Bazaar culture was central. Merchants from different regions sold spices, textiles, and crafts, while artisans produced goods that ranged from household items to luxury objects. Public fountains, baths, and coffee houses served as hubs of social life, facilitating exchange of information, gossip, and ideas. This urban vibrancy created a sense of shared community, even among diverse populations. Religious and communal life structured social organization. Muslims, Christians, and Jews often lived in distinct neighborhoods, attended their respective houses of worship, and maintained communal schools and courts under the millet system. This framework allowed communities to preserve traditions while participating in the broader imperial economy and governance. Religious festivals, public ceremonies, and charitable acts reinforced social bonds, projecting both piety and loyalty to the empire. Artisans and craftsmen held an important role in society. Guilds regulated training, quality, and commerce, ensuring that skills were passed down and that local economies remained stable. These organizations also provided social support and mutual aid, integrating economic activity with communal responsibility. Similarly, merchants and traders formed networks that connected towns, cities, and regions, facilitating not only commerce, but also the movement of ideas, culture, and technology. Education and intellectual life extended beyond religious instruction. Madrasas, libraries, and observatories fostered learning in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Scholars advised rulers, trained bureaucrats, and produced literature that reflected both Ottoman identity and engagement with broader global knowledge. Literacy and scholarship were markers of status and means of upward mobility, linking education to both social and political opportunity. Rural life, in contrast, centered on agriculture and local governance. Villages were often self-sufficient, producing food, textiles, and basic goods. Local leaders mediated disputes, collected taxes, and coordinated with provincial authorities, linking the countryside to the broader imperial structure. While life was less cosmopolitan than in the cities, rural populations contributed to the empire's economy and stability, supporting both military and administrative systems. Social mobility, though limited, was possible through military service, administrative achievement, or patronage. The devshirme system, for example, allowed Christian boys to rise through the ranks of the janissaries and civil administration, demonstrating the empire's capacity to integrate diverse populations into positions of influence. Similarly, successful merchants, artisans, or scholars could gain wealth, recognition, and even political power, creating incentives for loyalty and engagement with the state. Public works, charitable foundations, and religious endowments further integrated society. Mosques, schools, hospitals, and bridges were funded by waqf, often established by sultans, elites, or wealthy citizens. These projects not only served practical purposes, but also reinforced social cohesion, civic identity, and the visibility of imperial authority. Ordinary citizens directly experienced the empire's presence in their daily lives, linking personal welfare to loyalty and governance. The Ottoman social system balanced diversity with unity. Legal frameworks, communal autonomy, religious tolerance, and public infrastructure allowed millions of people from different ethnicities and faiths to coexist under a single political authority. This social cohesion was essential to maintaining order, supporting the economy, and sustaining military power across centuries. The Ottoman Empire's architectural and engineering achievements were a reflection of both imperial ambition and cultural sophistication. Cities were designed to project power, facilitate trade, and provide public services, blending functionality with aesthetic grandeur. Istanbul, the heart of the empire, became a showcase of this vision. Mosques, palaces, bridges, aqueducts, and marketplaces were constructed not merely as buildings, but as symbols of state authority, religious devotion, and civic pride. Mimar Sinan, the empire's most celebrated architect, transformed the skyline of Istanbul in the 16th century. His masterpieces, including the Süleymaniye Mosque and the Selimiye Mosque, exemplify a fusion of engineering skill and artistic vision. Massive domes, slender minarets, and intricate ornamentation created spaces that inspired awe while demonstrating the empire's technological and organizational capabilities. These projects required careful planning, coordination of labor, and mastery of materials, reflecting an administrative system capable of executing large-scale undertakings. Beyond mosques, the Ottomans excelled in urban infrastructure. Bridges spanned rivers to connect trade routes, facilitating the movement of goods, armies, and people. Roads were maintained to support commerce and military logistics, linking remote provinces with the imperial center. Aqueducts and waterworks supplied cities with clean water, supporting public health and urban growth. Bathhouses, marketplaces, and caravanserais were designed not only for utility, but also for social interaction, reinforcing community cohesion and cultural identity. Fortifications were another area of Ottoman engineering excellence. Cities and key strategic locations were protected by walls, bastions, and watchtowers, often incorporating the latest advances in artillery defense. Coastal fortresses in the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea safeguarded ports and trade routes, ensuring that the empire could project power and defend economic interests. These fortifications, combined with a disciplined army and navy, allowed the Ottomans to maintain control over contested regions for centuries. The empire's achievements extended to civil engineering as well. Irrigation systems improved agricultural productivity, enabling villages and towns to sustain larger populations. Public fountains and water distribution networks ensured that citizens had access to essential resources. These projects were often funded by waqfs, charitable endowments that reflected both piety and civic responsibility, linking engineering with social welfare. Ottoman urban planning emphasized harmony between public and private spaces. Markets, mosques, schools, and residential areas were integrated into cohesive neighborhoods. The layout of streets, public squares, and civic buildings facilitated both daily life and ceremonial events, allowing rulers to reinforce authority while providing practical benefits to residents. Cities became centers of commerce, learning, and culture, embodying the empire's values and ambitions. Architectural and engineering excellence also played a diplomatic and symbolic role. Foreign envoys and travelers were often struck by the grandeur of Ottoman cities, perceiving them as evidence of wealth, sophistication, and legitimacy. Monumental structures conveyed messages of power and stability, asserting the empire's status on both regional and global stages. The legacy of Ottoman architecture and engineering endures today. Bridges, mosques, palaces, and urban layouts continue to define the cultural landscapes of modern Turkey and former Ottoman territories. They serve as reminders that the empire's power was not only military or political, but also expressed through enduring contributions to infrastructure, art, and public life. By the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faced mounting pressures that signaled the beginning of a long decline. Internally, the centralized authority that had sustained centuries of conquest and governance was weakening. Succession disputes, palace intrigues, and corruption in the bureaucracy undermined efficiency. The once feared Janissary Corps had become politically powerful but increasingly undisciplined, resisting reforms and often intervening in succession or administrative disputes. Governors and local elites acted in their own interests, sometimes defying the Sultan's directives, further eroding centralized control. Economic challenges compounded these internal problems. The empire's control over trade routes was diminishing as European maritime powers, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established direct sea routes to Asia, bypassing Ottoman territories. Traditional industries, such as textiles and crafts, struggled to compete with imported European goods. Agricultural production, once the backbone of the empire, suffered from overtaxation, mismanagement, and periodic droughts, reducing revenues and straining the state's ability to fund military and administrative operations. Nationalism began to emerge as a powerful force within the empire. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Balkan peoples sought independence, inspired by European revolutionary ideals and encouraged by foreign powers. Revolts and uprisings became more frequent and harder to suppress. The Greek War of Independence, 1821-1832, was a particularly stark example. Despite brutal suppression efforts, international intervention ultimately secured Greek sovereignty, signaling to other groups that Ottoman control was not absolute. The empire also faced increasing pressure from European military and diplomatic advances. Wars such as the Crimean War, 1853-1856, revealed both the strategic importance of the Ottomans and their growing dependence on European allies for survival. While temporary military successes were possible, the empire's inability to fully modernize its army and navy left it vulnerable to technologically superior forces. European powers often dictated terms in treaties, undermining Ottoman sovereignty and signaling a shift in global power dynamics. Reform efforts, such as the Tanzimat reforms beginning in 1839, sought to modernize administration, law, and the military. These reforms included standardized taxation, new legal codes, and modernization of the army. While ambitious, they faced resistance from conservative factions and were unevenly implemented. Corruption, local resistance, and the sheer scale of the empire limited the effectiveness of reforms, leaving the underlying structural weaknesses largely intact. Territorial losses accelerated. By the late 19th century, nearly all Ottoman holdings in Europe were gone, and the empire struggled to maintain control over Arab provinces and North Africa. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 further shrank the empire, resulting in the loss of most European territories. These defeats highlighted the limits of Ottoman military and political power, demonstrating that centuries of dominance could not be sustained in the face of nationalist movements and industrialized European states. World War I became the final test. Aligning with the Central Powers, the Ottomans faced multiple fronts against Britain, France, Russia, and later Greece. Despite moments of resilience, such as the Gallipoli campaign, the empire was ultimately overwhelmed. Defeat led to occupation, the partitioning of territories, and a collapse of centuries of imperial authority. The war exposed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of an empire struggling to adapt to modern geopolitical realities. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a dominant global power, but a fragmented state fighting for survival. Its decline was the result of a complex interplay of internal decay, economic challenges, rising nationalism, and the relentless pressure of European industrialized powers. Yet even in decline, the empire's legacy endured in architecture, culture, law, and governance, providing the foundation for the modern Republic of Turkey and influencing the broader Middle East. The final collapse of the Ottoman Empire was dramatic, swift, and transformative, marking the end of a civilization that had lasted over 6 centuries. World War I accelerated the empire's demise. By aligning with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans hoped to reclaim lost territories and maintain relevance on the global stage. Instead, they faced military defeats on multiple fronts, economic collapse and social upheaval. Cities were occupied, infrastructure destroyed, and millions of people were displaced, creating a humanitarian crisis that reflected the empire's exhausted resources and overstretched administration. The war also fueled nationalist movements within the empire. Arab revolts, Greek military campaigns, and Armenian uprisings weakened Ottoman control further, fragmenting the empire from within. The Allies imposed harsh terms in the post-war treaties, particularly the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which proposed partitioning much of Anatolia and recognizing independent states in former Ottoman territories. The Sultanate was effectively powerless, and the old imperial system had no means to resist these pressures. Amid this turmoil, Mustafa Kemal emerged as a decisive leader. A former Ottoman officer, he rallied nationalist forces to resist foreign occupation and unify the remnants of the empire. Through strategic military campaigns and skillful diplomacy, he reclaimed much of Anatolia from Allied control. The Turkish War of Independence, 1919–1923, was both a military and political struggle, culminating in the establishment of a sovereign, secular nation-state. The Sultanate was abolished in 1922, ending centuries of Ottoman rule, and the Republic of Turkey was officially proclaimed in 1923. Atatürk's reforms fundamentally transformed Turkish society. The legal system was secularized, replacing Islamic law with civil codes inspired by European models. The Latin alphabet replaced the Arabic script, modern schools were established, and industrialization efforts began reshaping the economy. Religious institutions were reorganized, and public life was reoriented around a national identity rather than imperial allegiance. These changes represented a radical departure from centuries of Ottoman governance, while preserving certain cultural and historical legacies. The collapse of the empire also reshaped the Middle East. Former Ottoman territories in the Arab world, the Balkans, and North Africa became the focus of European mandates, new states, and nationalist movements. Borders were redrawn, communities were displaced, and political structures imposed from outside reshaped centuries-old social, economic, and cultural patterns. The consequences of the Ottoman disintegration continue to influence geopolitics in the region today. Despite its collapse, the Ottoman Empire's legacy remains profound. Its architectural masterpieces, legal innovations, cultural achievements, and administrative strategies influence successor states and modern governance. The empire's ability to manage diversity, integrate trade networks, and sustain a sophisticated civilization across 3 continents offers enduring lessons in statecraft and resilience. Modern Turkey, as well as the broader Middle East, carries echoes of Ottoman administration, law, and culture, bridging past and present. The story of the Ottoman Empire is ultimately one of rise, dominance, adaptation, and transformation. From a small Anatolian principality in the 13th century to a global empire spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa, it shaped history for centuries. Its fall was not sudden, but the result of cumulative pressures, internal decay, external threats, economic shifts, and rising nationalism. Yet even in defeat, the empire's impact endured, leaving a legacy of culture, governance, and identity that continues to resonate across the modern world. The story of the Ottoman Empire is more than just dates and battles. It's a lesson in power, resilience, culture, and transformation. If this journey through 6 centuries of triumphs, struggles, and enduring legacies fascinated you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most captivating empires. Share this video with friends who love history, comment below with the moment that surprised you the most, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that changes the way you see the past. History is alive, and your curiosity keeps it that way. Join us and let's uncover the world's greatest stories together.